Very exciting. Ms. Cloner will teach you styled components. We will use a Webshop source code as a base. It will give you many use cases to see how styled components is being used to style all aspects of a webshop. Let's get started. Actually, styled components cannot style anything by itself. It works hand in hand with CSS to style. It is CSS that does the direct styling. Styled components inject CSS into HTML. This has been a huge challenge for many years, basically since the web was developed. Where do we place CSS? Inline with the HTML or in a separate file? None of these alternatives was good enough. Placing CSS inline will make it impossible to read the HTML, since there are so many lines of CSS needed, no matter what simple thing you want to style. Placing the CSS in a separate file, one big one, it's difficult to find the CSS you need to edit, and you lose the connection between the HTML and CSS, and you risk styling the wrong component. Never mind. CSS is on the top 3 list of obstacles when learning web development. And styled components make CSS manageable. It's one of the keys to the kingdom of web development. You need a huge amount of styling, and you don't have a good enough technology to inject it into the HTML. Not until you choose styled components. The app we are using can be downloaded. This is a major advantage for you when learning styled components. You will want to play around and try styled components technologies by yourself. Let's have a look at the app in action. You see there is a list of products. Also you find a filter menu to the left. On top of the screen there is a small menu with sign in, sign out, orders, and more. Where do we need styled components? Wherever we need CSS, we need styled components. Without CSS everything will look like a very simple text editor with no colors, no fonts, nothing. Also it would not be possible to center items, or right align, left align, or give more space between text and the border of items. All this is being made possible with CSS. Let's have a look at the source code. We start by opening the index.css. Here we don't find any CSS. How about the app.js? Yes, here we find some CSS. Normally perhaps we don't have any CSS in the app.js, but in our case, we place the spinner here. What is a spinner? It is the animated icon showing when we wait for a process to finish. In this app, it is only used when we place an order. Never mind the spinner. It's not a good example of basic CSS. It is a special case where CSS is used to bend a rectangle and then animate it. Animation is a special area in CSS. This tutorial is here to teach you basic CSS. The type of CSS needed to create a webshop, or a normal website. If you want to impress your friends with animations, there are tens of thousands of tutorials on YouTube doing just that. Let's move on. Great. Let's move on to the shop.js file in the Pages folder. What is the difference between styled components and CSS? In shop.js you see an import statement for styled components. Then you see a number of const style div statements. And in the JSX part of the component, you see tags. The tags give very important insertion points for CSS. This is the most important feature of styled components. Being able to insert CSS at multiple points in the JSX. This solves an old problem where it was difficult to insert CSS to the HTML. Now with styled components, it's easy to insert CSS at a component level, with component scope. No risk of styling other components by mistake. Cool. I like creating styled components tags called page, row 1, row 2, and so on. Then on each row I usually divide into a couple of components, something like left, middle, right. In this case I chose to call it filter section, and product section. Filter for where I want to place the filter menu. And product for where I will place the list of product objects with image, price, and description. I see now there is a copy-paste mistake. Row 2 does not exist and yet there is a row 2 styled components tag. Oops. For row 1, here you see some CSS to be inserted. Download the source code and try making your own styled component. Let's start with the filter.js in the components folder. This is a handful. Lots of CSS, many styled components, etc. Why? Well, it's an important component, a filter menu. It is something we need in all web shops. And we use custom checkboxes and many different alternatives to control the list of products. So, let's dig into it. As usual, there is an import statement for the styled components. I don't use row 1 etc. here, since I see this component not as a page component. It's part of a page, the left side. I can see I have played around with the styled components here. It's not the best structure. There is one styled component called filter menu. There are hardly any CSS statements for that. But there are lots of class selectors with CSS in them. All that is to get the custom checkboxes to work out. I copied this code from the net and I did not need to get to know the details. You need not to dig into that either. Just know that all the code container etc. is to make the checkboxes look like they do. If you look into the JSX code, you see that I have the tag for filter menu, and then I use inline CSS. This is silly, I almost never use inline CSS, I always use styled components. Never mind. For the product style tag I use some style component props. I control the background color with props. Because when a product style item is selected I want it to be black. Otherwise white. And inverted for the color of the text. For the product style tag I also use inline CSS. No, that's only what it looks like. It is actually the props I send into the styled component. I use JSX expressions to control if it's the prop string white or black that will be sent to the styled component. As you can see further down we have class name equal to container1. This is styled with the help of a class selector that I have in the filter menu styled component. Not the best structure. But it works fine. Styled components are powerful in many ways and let you solve your CSS needs with ease. Enough of the filter component. Let's move on to look at the products component. With CSS you make things happen. But first you need to find a way to insert the CSS with some tool. And this is what styled components do for you. The pages component is a small one. It has the import statement for the styled components. It has one styled component, page segmented is called. In the JSX code you see a JSX expression. It's a map expression. It loops the array filtered products and calls the product component for each entry. This is it for this component. We move on to the product component to see what kind of styled components technology is in use there. The product component in the components folder has of course an import statement for the styled components. It has a product item styled component division. In the product component, we use some inline CSS. It's just the way it is. I usually place all CSS in styled components in class selectors. But sometimes it makes sense to just place some small bits and pieces of CSS inline in the HTML code. Fair enough. I feel this part of the styled components tutorial is tough. Many technologies need to play together to make a web shop styling. It's the Flexbox, it's styled components, it's absolute and relative positioning, it's finding the importance of class selectors, and it's inline CSS with its own unique camel case text. Now that we have covered all that, in just a couple of minutes, the rest of this tutorial will flow better? I hope so. I believe this is one of the key obstacles when learning web development, the Css obstacle. When you know you are supposed to use styled components, class selector, flexbox, absolute positioning, your life gets easier. If you try solving CSS without styled components, it's a nightmare. If you try using all types of selectors, you will run into all kinds of problems. If you try to use float or grid view instead of flexbox, you are also in trouble. Let's celebrate. You now have a solution to the CSS challenge. Hooray! Another key component of this webshop is the header.js. You will find the import statement for styled components. You will find a number of styled component divs. You will find I used my technology in dividing the header with help of styled components, page and rows. In row 1 left component you find the little logo, it's both a styled component, and it has some inline CSS. In the R1 mid section there is nothing. In the R1 right section, there is the menu. Nice structure? In the R1 styled components you will find Css Flexboxes, the most common CSS element for me. In row 2 left section there is a medium-sized logo. Nothing in the mid section. In the right section we have the icon-based menu. How do I get the right styled component to be on the right part of the screen? I use a FlexGrow 8 on the middle section. Why 8? I don't know, it just works. There are other solutions, but this one is very easy to implement. Let's move on to the styled components of a modal. Let's pick the modal sign in. It's got the import statement for styled components. It's got a number of styled components and class selectors. First, it has a couple of styled components to make the characteristic on top look and feel. A component called modal, just to show and hide. For some reason I have a modal1 container and a background component, it should be enough with one of them. Pay attention, we use the CSS statement position fixed. After those components, it's much like a normal web page. We use row-styled components to divide the page. We use class selectors to inject the CSS with surgical precision. That's it for the CSS of a modal. Play around with the code. You can easily make your own styled components now. If you need help with the modals, we have a film on just that. We have many films covering the different technologies of this web shop. So, go ahead and hit the subscribe button to not miss out. Let's wrap this up. Just to be sure you did get all the important stuff. Use styled components and class selectors to inject CSS into your HTML. Use the Flexbox to style basically anything: horizontal menu lists, vertical menu lists, wrapping product lists, position logos and headers, to make columns of menu items in the footer. Flexbox is so important. When you design your product presentation in the shop, you need position relative and position absolute. And when you make modals, you will need position fixed. When you have lots of information in a filter menu, use overflow scroll. The best way of learning styled components is to download this source code and play around with it. A final piece of advice. Use background color when you debug CSS. That way you will see the full size of the div and you will know if you need to position left, right, center, add padding, or add margin. That decision is difficult when you don't see where one div stops and the next one starts. Now download the source code and get going. There is a clone tutorial as well, a bigger project. It has this Webshop plus Stripe checkout, Send-in Blue integration, and cloud functions for webhooks. See the description below.